On today's Truth Factor discussion, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 22, and we'll begin the final hours of Jesus that leads up to his death upon the cross of Calvary. We'd like to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today for our study. Paul, would you mind taking a moment and let everybody know how they can participate in today's discussion?
I'll be happy to do that, John. As we look here at our study today, you might like to participate. We sure hope that you will. And there are a number of ways you can do that. If you're watching at live.truthfactor.com or the Truth Factor viewing page, there is a new chat there that you might utilize, and you can make comments and ask questions. If you're watching on YouTube, it has a built-in chat, and you can use that as well. YouTube/Truth Factor Live. Or even if you're watching on Facebook, the Truth Factor Live Facebook page, you can comment on the video, and we'll include that as well. And it's one of our favorite parts of our study when you can join us and we can bring in your comments and ask your questions to the panel so that we can benefit from your participation as well as what we have to present today.
Paul, I appreciate that. I forgot that I had a nice little video set up to play that plays along the bottom. So hopefully people got to see it a little bit there. And thank you so much for doing that. Tom, let's go ahead and bring you up, and we'll have you, if you would, sir, to tell us what we're studying and where we're studying today.
Okay, we are beginning today in Luke chapter 22 and verse number 1. Obviously, we're coming to the toward the end of the week that would lead up to the crucifixion, and Luke chapter 22, which is a rather lengthy chapter. If you look at all the Gospels, the chapters dealing with that final night as well as dealing with his crucifixion, they're lengthy chapters. Because there's a lot of things that happen, and the first half of Luke 22 is just dealing with events that lead up to his arrest, namely the institution of the Lord's Supper and some other things associated with that. So that's where we're going to be today, and we'll see how far we get. But anyways, let's go ahead and start with Luke chapter 22 and in verse number 1. Where we find the Feast of the Unleavened Bread is drawing near. And if I could get, Brian, could I get you to read verses 1 through 6 of this?
Absolutely, Tom. Thank you very much. I'll be reading Luke chapter 22, verses 1 through 6. I'll be reading today from the New King James Version of the Bible. Now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, which is called Passover. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. So he went his way and conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he promised and sought opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of the multitude.
Okay, thank you for reading that, Brian. As we look at these verses here, first of all, the truth factoring questions for those who might be in the audience and are interested in that. When you look at this text, did Judas actually lose his free will on this particular occasion? You know, we read there in verse number 3 about Satan entering into Judas. So what are your thoughts dealing with that particular subject? And in the meantime, just taking a few moments to deal with this particular context here, we find in verse number 1 that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is drawing near, which is called the Passover. And as I understand, this Feast of Unleavened Bread is a feast that lasted 7 or 8 days, and so actually began with the day of Passover, the 14th of Nisan and so on. And as that was approaching, there was a meal that was observed by the Jews and so on. And it is on this occasion that Jesus is going to deal with that. So hold on one second here. Sorry about that. Anyways, that's what we're dealing with on this particular occasion. And so we find here, as I look at this, what scheming were the priests and the scribes plotting at this time? Anybody care to deal with that, or? Paul or anybody?
Tom, sorry. As we look there, they were accusing him. We read in verse 2 about basically, I think what one of the terms that we would call this is sedition, that he is trying to raise a stir against the Roman government. We see that a little more in chapter 3. But they want to get him arrested, get him contained, and then arrange that betrayal to take place.
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, and even more clearly in verse number 2, it tells us there that they sought how they might kill him. I mean, that's ultimately what they're scheming to do. We got to get rid of this man. And
it is there, Tom, that they feared the people.
Yes.
I think that's really a significant point, because it wasn't that they respected that this was God's plan. It wasn't that they were even evaluating whether Jesus was due the respect that he should have. But instead, we see that here, because they have opposed him all along, if he develops this following and people believe in him as the Christ and they have opposed him, well, then we see pretty clearly that it's going to be the end of them. And so they're afraid of the people. And so I think they have a mentality, it's him or us, rather than let's get on board with what he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, if you were to go over to John 12 and look after the raising of Lazarus, those are basically, I don't have the exact verse, but those are basically the words that are used by them. If we leave him alone, everybody's going to follow after him. And so they're scheming to get rid of him. And what's interesting is, we're dealing with an event that's actually recorded in all three of what we call the synoptic gospels. And what's great about comparing these things, putting them together, you get different types of details. And in Matthew's account dealing with this, is kind of interesting as they're scheming to do this. One of the things that said there is, they did not really want to do this during the Feast of the Passover. I'm thinking what they wanted to do is they wanted to arrest him and just kind of imprison him and then deal with him after the Passover was over. But that was not going to happen, because that was not in God's plans, because Jesus was in control, and points of emphasis needed to be made concerning what he was doing. So you find the scheming. They need to kill him. They need to completely get rid of him, because that's the only way you're going to get the people to quit following after him. And I totally agree with you with the idea of the crowd. They feared the people, because people typically can see through corruption, number one, especially when it becomes more blatant. And secondly, you're dealing with the common people who are looking for hope, and they've seen it in Jesus, and the more that he does, the more they're going to see that. So they got to get rid of him, and that is their reasoning. And of course, they're not going to be able to wait, because of things that Jesus has done, and that's what's taking place here. So anyways, as we find that taking place, we read there in verse number 3 that Satan enters into Judas Iscariot. And he goes to the chief priests, and how does he seek for opportunity to carry out this plan? Or what scheming does he do with these religious leaders?
Tom, he sets out to kind of say, what will you give me if I can bring them to you?
Yeah, exactly. That's what you have. He goes to the leaders. He knows that the leaders want to find a way to get Jesus away from them. And so basically he goes to them, and he's ready to betray them, and he asks them. They agree to give him money. Now we read in some of the other gospels, the other accounts of this, that he asks them, what will you give me? And of course, I believe it's Matthew's gospel that tells us 30 pieces of silver, which significant from the standpoint of I think it was the price of a slave, the purchase of a slave, which would have been a substantial amount, but nevertheless, that was the case. And also, the other thing is that was a number that was actually quoted, I believe it was in Zechariah in the Old Testament. And you find the scheming taking place here. So they're scheming for an opportunity to betray Jesus, and that's what we have happening here. Any other questions or thoughts about these verses?
You know,
We do have
it's
a.
interesting. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
It's interesting in Acts chapter 12 that whenever they arrest Peter, well, they put the James to death first, but they intend to wait till after the feast to bring Peter forward to put to death. I think there's some issue too. Part of it is that the Bible says pretty clearly in Mark 14 and in Matthew, I think as well, that they don't want this to be a public spectacle, and so that's one of the reasons they want to wait till the feast is over. But perhaps according to Acts 12, or maybe suggesting there, is that it might in some way desanctify or desecrate the feast if he were put to death in their minds too. At one point, I think it's in the Gospel of John, they talk about the idea that they don't want to, they want to make sure that they're clean enough to go partake of the Passover. So that might be part of this logic as well of waiting.
Yeah, exactly. But it's going to backfire. John, did you have something?
Well, I just want to just let you know we do have a couple comments in the chat area.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and deal with those comments, and then let's go ahead and tackle this question about the free will of Judas.
Okay.
And if anybody has anything on that.
All right. Let's see. We're going to first bring in a comment, not a comet, by Stephen James. He says Judas seems always to have been on the periphery of the disciples. He was a thief who stole from the money bag. It isn't too surprising that Judas, with the help of Satan, was easily swayed. That's a good point.
Absolutely. I mean, that exactly is what you find in Judas. John 12, and I think verse number 6 is the passage that talks about how he was the treasurer, but he stole money. He was called a thief, and he took money from the money box. So he was kind of greedy. He was looking to make a profit off of this.
That's right. Gregory Hinckley writes, Judas allowed Satan to enter. Judas had to believe the lie. This was a good thing. Had to believe the lie that this was a good thing to commit this atrocity. Yeah. He had to believe it, and he did.
And that's a good point. And both of those comments kind of lead toward this question about did Judas lose his free will? And did you have any other comments more specifically directed toward that, or
no?
No. Comments? And okay, well, if not, what do you all think about that? Just real quick before we move on, could Judas have said no?
Tom, I would think so.
I believe so also, and some of the reasons behind it is a little later on in this chapter when Jesus announces his betrayal. He says he has the greater sin. So there's implications that he had a say in this, and of course, Satan's not going to tempt us in those areas where we're not vulnerable. And,
right.
and I think that's why the character of Judas is described in so many places. The bad character of this particular Judas, he was a thief, and so it was going to be easy for him to be bribed and to do these things. And I know I've also heard it debated, and I don't know if this is true or not, but and we don't know if it's true or not, but as many times as Judas had seen Jesus get out of dilemmas that he was in, could it be that he was just thinking, you know what, this is a chance for me to make some money. Jesus will get out of this too, and so he just moves forward with it.
Yeah.
So, anyways, what's your thoughts?
One thing we have to keep in mind, and I answered that yes, I think Judas could have made the decision not to do it, but it is a moot point because you think about all the Pharisees that rejected Christ. Had they not rejected Christ, he would not have died upon the cross. And so we may ask, well, could they have accepted him? I guess academically, yes, their minds could have been persuaded, but the truth is, no. Their minds were made up. They were set. In same case, I think this is why Jesus chose Judas. Not because Judas was predetermined by the sovereignty of God to do this, but knowing the heart of Judas, this would be the role that he would ultimately play.
Yeah, exactly. And I totally agree with the point that you're making. And we've had discussions on this program before about the hardening of Satan's or of Pharaoh's heart. And it's the same type of an idea there. It's not removing Pharaoh's free will, but it's just his disposition as such that God knew how he would respond, and he would use that to accomplish his purpose. And that's the same thing with Judas here.
I was thinking about this and in considering it, I think there's a point here, and people say, well, if God knew that he would, then did he have a choice and things like that. I think we get into things about God that are beyond our ability to understand, how we can't know the heart, we can't know the mind of another person, but God can. And so I think that is part of our difficulty there.
Yes.
And so I would just caution us not to get involved in God's business in that sense. That when the Scripture says it, there's some things we have to accept, just that they're that way, but that certainly no man has ever been forced to do evil, and certainly I don't mind asking the question that I saw in a chat that I think Brian brought up, and Brian might have some thoughts about this, about whether we see Peter does something very, very bad too, but Peter weeps bitterly, he repents. Could Satan have, or could not Satan, but could Judas have done that? I don't know why not. But I think we have to be careful not to get involved in judging things that only God is capable of knowing, and how he knows that is only part of who God is.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I'm reminded of what a preacher said a while ago. I don't remember how long before, but he said there are questions I cannot answer, and there are answers I cannot question. And we always need to keep that in mind as we're approaching things concerning who God is and so on. So, anyways, any other thoughts on this before we move on? So, if not, in the next section after this takes place, instructions are given for preparing a place for the Passover to be observed. And in Luke chapter 22, verses 7 through 13, Paul, can I get you to read those verses for me?
Certainly be glad to do that. And you'd like me to read beginning at verse 7 down through verse 13, I believe.
Yes.
Okay. When we read there in Luke 22, beginning at verse 7, it says, "Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat.' So they said to him, 'Where do you want us to prepare?' And he said to them, 'Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large, furnished upper room. There, make ready.' So they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover."
Okay, so thank you. So this kind of begins here in verse number 7, observing that this day of unleavened bread, the Passover day, is approaching, and apparently the Passover lamb was killed the day before, or if it's an evening meal, which the Jewish calendar I think starts at 6 sundown, and it's very likely, if that is the case, that that they're preparing the lamb either the day before is the way that it's described there. And Peter and John are basically sent into town, and what are they told to do? And incidentally, as far as a question for the chat room in this, again, this is another one of those we're not sure about questions, but just your thoughts on this. Do you think that the events mentioned here, are they miraculous, providential, or pre-planned? I think arguments could be made for any of those, but anyways, getting back to that one. So while you're thinking about that, what are Peter and John told to do?
They were to go into the city, look for a certain man doing a certain thing, and ask him about a certain place. And when I read that, I almost went back and reread it because I think that the significance is that when they did this, they found it just as Jesus said it would be. And
Exactly. Yeah.
so I think that is it. That here the general instruction was go and find a place to have the Passover. But then when they said, well, how should we do this? They're given specific instructions. And when they are given specific instructions, it happens exactly as Jesus said it would happen.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, and that's what you have. And there's not a lot of doctrinal discussion going through this particular text. The only thing that's kind of interesting here is Jesus knows what's going to happen, and this Passover meal has to be prepared, and there's a place that's secured so that it can take place. And they're told to go into town, and they'll find a man carrying a pitcher of water. And as I understand, that within itself would be a little bit unusual, considering the times. Typically, when men carried water, it would be the drinking bottle on their side or something like that. It would be the women that would be carrying the pitchers of water as a part of their daily routines for cooking and cleaning and those types of things. And so that would be the unusual circumstance here, that which would set this man apart from others, within this community. And of course, when they found him, basically ask him. The teacher says to ask, "Where's the guest room so that we can eat the Passover?" And he's going to show you a large furnished upper room. There, make ready. And it's interesting that this room's going to be furnished. So it is a room that basically is prepared or suitable for them to observe this Passover meal. So, any other thoughts on that?
Let me throw a question to you guys, something I've always been curious about. Jesus seems to make some of the nature of this Passover meal distinct. In other words, he talks about, I want to celebrate this Passover with you. Is it the case that this would be a little unusual? First of all, if I'm correct, we haven't seen Jesus celebrate the Passover with his disciples previously. And if I'm not incorrect, the Passover would be more of a family feast where you were expected to have that with your family. And in this case, these disciples, we assume it's just the 12 apostles and not their families or anybody else with them. Do you think this is an unusual Passover feast? In other words, that it's Jesus celebrating it with people that he normally did not, and you would not expect to celebrate this feast with?
If one thing that I would say about that is the Passover was a family event, and that's really what it was intended to be. And of course, this has become his family. As a matter of fact, I believe it is isn't it on this occasion in John, John 14 through, or John 13 through 16, that Jesus says, "You are my family," among other things to them. Or I've called you friends, and various things like that. So it's intimate from that standpoint. But typically, it was a private family matter. The Passover was not a public meal. It was, and so that could be a little bit of a distinction here. It's very likely that the apostles were with their own families at the observance of the Passover when they were home, in years prior to this. So that's just a thought.
I think Brian brings out a really interesting point here that we would see and consider that I have been away from family before for certain holidays that we recognize in our country. And in thinking about that, it has been sort of awkward to know that you're not going to be with family. And I've had members of the church before, people who I was close to, take me in and make me part of their family. And it is interesting that, we're going to read about how those who would obey the gospel, that they're going to become children of God. And basically, as Jesus is the only begotten Son of the Father, that, we're going to become in a family relationship with him and with the Father and with one another. And so maybe there is a little more significance there than what but I had given it to the I desire to eat this Passover with you. I wouldn't make a point of controversy about it if someone disagreed. But I think there's really a great point there of how Jesus felt about these men who were going to be doing his work after he was gone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And of course, that's leading into that's leading into the next section that we want to look at. So basically, we find the preparations taking place going through verse number 13. And going back to the chat room question, I don't know, John, has anybody given any comments or anything, thoughts dealing with this truth factoring question or discussion question?
Yes.
Okay.
The question, we'll pose it again, was, do you think the events mentioned in this text were miraculous, providential, or pre-planning? Stephen says, I think that God orchestrates events in our lives to a much greater degree than we generally realize, as in every hair on our head is numbered. That's an interesting point and a very good thought to consider. Let's move on. Or go ahead, Tom. Do you want to say something about that?
No, I totally agree with the way Stephen says. I mean, that's a good way to observe this. When I asked this question, I mentioned at the beginning is, really there is no definitive answer. There, you could make arguments for or against all three of these, because they're all possibilities. It could literally be a miraculous situation taking place, or more than likely just providence lining up. Which involves the hand of God, or it could be that there was an occasion where Jesus had pre-planned this, and for whatever reason he did not announce the address, and there's speculation about that. But whatever the case, what needed to take place is exactly what takes place.
Okay. Moving on, Gregor Hinckley writes regarding the second question, yes, miraculous that Jesus knew of the water pitcher fella. The room was supplied by a believer. Pre-planning that Jesus knew he would allow them to use the room. Providential. So he kind of sees each aspect of this to be this way.
That's that's kind of interesting, tying them all together. Yeah. One of the things, not getting into a discussion of providence, but when we talk about providence being God working through natural means, God is still working. So it's easy to plug that as the hand of God, and and say it could just as easily be miraculous from that standpoint. So that's a good observation. Anything else?
Yes, Stephen James has one more comment, though not related to the question directly. This had to do something with what we're talking about a little bit earlier. Maybe the field has now narrowed to his closest 12. That might make this a very special occasion, talking about what y'all were discussing earlier of those who were gathered together there with him.
Yeah, and I do see it that way as well. We know that Jesus had a group of disciples that was larger than the 12. It would have consisted of probably at least 70, the 70 that were sent out as recorded in Luke chapter 10, and others. Now, if any of those had whittled down from this time, but he had a pretty good gathering that was pretty close to him. But we're told in this and in the sister accounts that this was the apostles that were gathered together with him. As a matter of fact, in verse number 14, we read about this being the 12. And if there's nothing further, John, could I get you to read verses 14 through 18 as we continue to deal with this subject here?
Yes, 14 through 18. All righty. When the hour had come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. Then he said to them, with fervent desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Then he took the cup and gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among yourselves, for I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes.
Okay, so here we have an interesting occasion. And the question that I have here for the chat group dealing with this is, if you keep reading through the book of Luke into the next section where the Lord's Supper is instituted, Luke is the only gospel that actually mentions 2 cups. Why do you think we have 2 cups mentioned in this particular context here? And how do they relate to the instituting of the Lord's Supper? And of course, that's getting into the next few verses, but just kind of keep that in mind, and we'll briefly deal with that when we get to the end of our discussion here. So as we continue here with verses 14 through 20, what was it that Jesus said to as he sat with the 12? And we've actually been discussing this, so I guess I need to let Brian answer that.
You know, it is interesting that he says, I had a fervent desire to take this Passover with you. And of course, that's telling us so many different things, but that this Passover is different from everything else. Should I dare say every Passover all the way back to the first one, that this is the real reason for the Passover. You know, I don't think we'd be overly bold to say that the original Passover looked to this moment as opposed to this moment looking back to it.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the whole point, and we've already been bringing all of this out, this is a special occasion. You know, I mean, typically when we think of special occasions, we think of joyful occasions. And typically the Passover meal was a joyful occasion. I mean, it was festive. It was set up to be festive, but also solemn from the standpoint of reminding them about the Exodus. You know, I guess you could ask the question, where does the Passover come from? And we don't really have time to go into detail. Just short answer, read Exodus 12 and a little bit following that. And it had to do with the 10th plague and a feast that was observed with the blood being spread over the doorposts and the angel of death passing over those houses where that was taking place. And they were to remember this every year, kind of as a promise that God looks out for his people. And that's really the point, and he delivers his people. Well, here it is. But this is a special occasion because Jesus makes that observation. I have this fervent desire to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. You know, the events that are about to happen, he's acknowledged, I'm about to face everything that I've been leading up to. And I might want to add one of the things we've talked about as we've gone through Luke. I'm about to suffer the things that I've told you about. I've warned you about over and over and over that this is what's about to happen. And then he concludes that in verse 16, you know, by observing, you know what, I'm no longer going to eat this until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. What do you think of, does anybody have any comments or thoughts about that particular expression there?
There might be 2 things we might think of. First of all, Jesus has, in fact, in the last chapter, we were talking about things that would be fulfilled in the kingdom, again, pointing to how immediately close the kingdom's inauguration is going to be. Of course, for this conversation, we're just talking days at this point. So there is the sense of that. It also kind of points to the idea that when we partake of the Lord's Supper, which is instituted in this moment, and from what we're reading here, we are partaking in this with the Lord in a fashion, that we are the body of Christ that take it, and that it is, you know, in that sense, we are taking it with Jesus. So maybe those are some of the things we're thinking about, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I see in that. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, if not, let's just real quickly tackle this cup here. It says he takes the cup and he gives thanks. Take this and divide it among yourselves. I want all of you to partake of that which is in this cup. And we really don't have time to engage in a discussion on the contents versus the container. Clearly, the contents is representative of the blood of Jesus. At least it will be when he does institute the Lord's Supper. You know, this actually, this particular time here, he's not instituting the Lord's Supper as this particular cup is being passed around. At least not yet. It's going to be instituted in the next few verses. But here he just said, you know, take this and divide it among yourself. And then I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And I believe that that's a message of fellowship, associated with them, true fellowship that's going to be related and associated with the kingdom that, like Brian said, is going to be established just in a few days from then, probably about 52 days, something to that effect, with considering when Pentecost was versus the day that he is crucified and the night before. So any other thoughts on that? Okay, if not, John, any comments from the chat room on this discussion question?
Yes, Stephen James. Let's see. Stephen James has a comment here. He says, this seems to parallel Paul's mention of being poured out like a drink offering. I'd like to know the significance of this.
Okay. Yeah, good observation there. Paul uses this observation, obviously, of I'm being poured out as a drink offering, to make the point that he realizes he's about to die, and he's willing to accept that. And Jesus is doing the same thing on this particular occasion. Any other comments on the second cup, or I'll throw some stuff out there. Is that it, John?
You got a comment, Tom? Good. I want to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Well, what I want to say is I remember the one year that I went to Florida College, and I was taking the New Testament history and geography. I remember it was observed that the Passover feast actually involved the giving of 4 cups. And as a matter of fact, if you have the Guardian of Truth commentary series, I think it's Caldwell did his commentary on Luke. He gives a very brief paragraph discussing the 4 different cups. Very likely this is one of those cups, and what Jesus is doing is during, and here's the point, during the Passover, he's passing it around to them, and they're going to partake of the Passover. And I don't believe that this is actually the institution of the Lord's Supper. We find that he institutes the Lord's Supper after the Passover meal is completed. So he takes some of the elements that are there, and from that he institutes the Lord's Supper. So you might very well say that this is the last Passover recognized by God, as a part of his chosen people. So I just see the idea of Jesus is passing the cup around. Distribute this among yourself. And it's either part of the Passover meal, or he's just giving instructions. If they didn't drink all of it, they're going to use some of it for the institution of the Lord's Supper, which hasn't happened as this is taking place. So that's my thoughts on that. My 2 cents is.
Yeah, Tom, I think those are good comments. I know that one thing we consider is that with the Passover, there's no mention of any cup at all of the fruit of the vine in the Old Testament that was part of that. So at some point from that moment to the moment Jesus is taking it, somehow the fruit of the vine was introduced as part of the Passover, or at least it was, a common thing in the Passover. Now, to kind of support what you're saying about the possibility of the tradition of 4 cups, and by the way, that's a pretty common tradition today. Jews today observe 4 cups, and as far back as we can read about the traditions of the Jews, again, not the law of Moses, but the tradition of the Jews, those 4 cups were present. But supporting that idea is the term that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 16. In that instant, Paul calls the cup which we use, not the, and again, you said it earlier, Tom, not the literal cup, but the emblem of what was in the cup. He calls it the cup of blessing, which is in fact the traditional name for the 3rd cup of the 4 cups. So what's very interesting about that is that it seems that the cup that Jesus distributed among them was the 2nd cup, perhaps, and that it's the 3rd cup that he takes. Now, Tom, that might mean that the 4th cup they didn't take, that they might have left before they participated in that 4th cup, and then you'll see Jesus praying at the Mount of Olives about letting the cup of his suffering pass from him. There could be a connection in those things too, but I think it's just too speculative to make much for certain about that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. By the way, you mentioned what the Jews did in addition to the 4 cups. They also participated in what we call the Halal, which was a group of 15 songs. It begins and I believe it's number 120 and goes through 34. If I'm
The
not
Psalms of Ascent, yeah.
Yeah. The Psalms of Ascent and so on. So you got these Halal songs that they would sing. They would read the scripture. The Exodus 12 and all that. So it was designed to remind them of their heritage, basically. And so all of that was associated with the partaking of this. Exactly how Jesus did it according to the Jewish law, I don't know. What changes he made, we don't know. So that's a great point that you make there, because this is a special occasion with what's happening here. And it leads to the institution of the Lord's Supper. So unless anybody else has comments, let's go ahead and get to that next section.
Hey, Tom.
Here. We are moving along pretty quickly, so.
I've got one quick comment. Hopefully it won't slow us down. Hang on just a second. There we go. What I was wondering, I've often wondered when, and y'all have already pointed this out, when you go back to the Old Testament institution of the Passover, there was nothing said about what to drink. And now we are here 1,500 years later, give or take 30 years or so. And Jesus is now instituting, or he is partaking the Passover with them. And there is the cups like y'all were talking about. So somewhere between point A and point B, either God said nothing about it, and then the Jews by tradition brought it in, or God said something about it, we don't have a record, and the Jews just abided by. I tend to think it's more tradition. And I used to hold that view pretty strongly, that, well, it's just by tradition they brought it in. But isn't it interesting with what you're about to take us into, that what was not originally in the scriptures about what to drink, Jesus is now about to use it to establish the feast that will remember him. So maybe there was a providence of God that ultimately brought the fruit of the vine into the Passover feast.
Yeah, and that's a good point there, John. And with that in mind, verses 19 and 20, I'll go ahead and read these real quick. I actually meant to have that read with going through verse 18, or did we read through verse 20?
We did not.
We did not. Okay. Well, it goes on and it says that he took bread and he gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." And of course, you can tie that together with Matthew and Mark's account, as well as 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where we find the significance of the Lord's Supper. And you can also tie to it Acts 20 as to when we are to partake of the Lord's Supper, which is on the first day of the week. So here Jesus takes this occasion and he turns from the Passover to the institution of the Lord's Supper. And incidentally, people ask, why do we use unleavened bread? You know, if you look at websites nowadays that are giving PowerPoint and pictures of the emblems associated with the Lord's Supper, many of them will have a rising loaf of bread. And I still have a problem with that because, striving to follow the pattern, one thing we do know from Exodus chapter 12 is that it was unleavened bread.
Tom, that's such an interesting point. When we worshipped overseas, there was some debate about this among the brethren as to whether or not leavened or unleavened could be used. One of the things about the leavening is throughout the scriptures, leavening is kind of symbolic for sin. Like Paul talks about a little to the Corinthians, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And leaven kind of represents this contamination. So it's interesting that Jesus pulls out unleavened bread and he says, this bread represents my body. Now, one of the things we know about Jesus in the flesh was that he was without sin, that he would be, that he was tempted in all ways as we are, yet without sin. So if you had to say what kind of emblem is going to represent the body of Jesus, it would be an emblem that in some way manifests the idea of being without sin. And I think that ingrained into the Jewish mind, and should be ingrained into our mind, leaven is the representation of sin. So the perfect representation would be something without leavening. That would be representing the body that never sinned.
Yeah, good point there. Any other thoughts dealing with this?
Well, and this was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So if
Yeah,
we're going to follow, by example, that's what Jesus took and used, and therefore we do the same. If we were to step beyond that, the question would be, how much farther could we step beyond it? Would we even have to use fruit of the vine and bread? So if we're going to follow the examples, but I like Brian's comment. I hadn't thought about that as well, but it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
It's interesting to what you said there, John. They were so intent on that no leavening. You probably heard the stories that they clean out leavening from the house. Well, they were not allowed to have fermented wine at that time either. What we call the Elephantine letters tell about writing of how they observed the Passover a few centuries before Christ, and they said it couldn't be fermented wine because fermented wine was a leavening. It was that type of leavening. So if somebody says, well, Jesus was using a fermented wine for that, that actually was contrary to what they thought was appropriate for it.
I think that's a good point. Good point.
yeah. You very, very, very much so. So great comments dealing with this. Of course, we could spend an entire study on the Lord's Supper and its significance and so on, but here we just find the time of its appointment and so on, and just it's an explanation of why we do what we do the way that we do it. Where the Lord's Supper is concerned. So, any other thoughts dealing with these two verses? Okay, if not, in the next section, in verses 21 through 23, and actually, Brian, why don't you go ahead and just read verses 21 through 30, because this is basically describing some discussion that Jesus engages in on this occasion.
I'll be glad to do that, Tom. So Luke chapter 22, verses 21 through 30. But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. And truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. Then they began to question among themselves which of them it was who would do this thing. Now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves it? Is not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. But you are those who have continued with me in my trials. And I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
Okay, thank you for reading that, Brian. So here we find among the things that are taking place in verses 21 through 23, associated with this meal, and as far as the timing, I think some of the other Gospels deal with this before before the institution of the Lord's Supper. It's all tied together on this occasion. Exactly at what point during the meal he does this, we don't know. But he basically is announcing that Judas Iscariot is going to betray him, though the way it's written, he doesn't mention his name in so many words. But John's account of this makes it known that he reveals it, at least to his apostles and so on. And so that's one of the things that takes place here. And basically, so what does Jesus say about his betrayer? He says he's here at this table. And then he makes the observation in verse number 22, truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. What are your thoughts on that particular statement there? Or does anybody have any thoughts? The idea of one being betrayed and being judged. Well, the thoughts that I have on it, since nobody else is speaking up. Since nobody else is speaking, I think this leans toward the fact that Judas had accountability for what happened here. This isn't a matter of when Satan entering into Judas that he just took over and Judas had zero control. I think the same thing is true with Peter. When Peter was asked to sift him, but that's not to say that his influence was not stronger than normal. And of course, he was appealing to the character of Judas, as we've already noted. But he says, "Woe to that man! Woe to the one who would take the time to betray me." And that's fully understandable, especially when you realize that Judas has been with Jesus now for these 3.5 years. Judas was one of the 12 that was sent out, that probably saw great things accomplished, great success when those things took place. And yet, in spite of all that, he's obviously not totally converted to the Lord, at least as Lord. He's maybe converted to Jesus as to who he is, but he's not loyal to him from the standpoint of as some of the others were. Any thoughts on that? If not, we find they begin to question among themselves who would do this thing. And we find in the others that, they all were asking the question, is it I? I think Matthew's account, even Judas himself asks the question, and as you have said it, is the response that is there. And if you go over to John's account, in John chapter 13, Jesus basically tells the disciple whom he loved, who is believed to be John as well as Peter, that it's the one dipping his bread in my cup along with me, and Judas Iscariot was doing that. So that's some details from other accounts on this. So any other thoughts on this?
Go
ahead, Brian.
No, go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
Well, no, all I was going to do is to suggest that we've got a couple of comments here in the chat room that we could bring up, but we might want to bring those in and maybe hold off till our next study, the kind of the tackling of the fourth chat question and the remainder of the text would be a suggestion.
Okay, and I totally agree with that, because it might take us 3 weeks to get through this chapter, but it's 70-something verses, so we're moving at a good pace, I believe. So let's just wrap it up here. Go ahead and bring those comments in, John.
Well, Brian, what were you going to say
No, actually, just that it was some interesting comments, but let's go ahead and actually bring the comments in.
Okay. Stephen James says it's interesting that Christ continually recognized Judas from the beginning, such as, but one of you is a devil, etc. Yeah, he was not caught off guard by this at all. Great point. Yeah, and then we had another comment by Brian. What is interesting to me is that none of the disciples instantly thought of Judas, showing that Jesus had not ever acted impartially towards Judas. Brian, that's a good point. And then lastly, Stephen says, right, Brian, all the while Judas has acted contrary to a real disciple, being thief, disloyalty. To the fourth question, I believe that we must think and act like humble servants, and that would be a good thing to consider, especially for as we continue the study.
Yeah, exactly. As a matter of fact, our next discussion question is going to be dealing with that very point that he just made there. So that's a good point. But anyways, we are up to the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here, and then next week we will, or in 2 weeks, we will resume our chapter. Next week, I guess, can I go ahead and say this, John, or did you want to say it? Next week
you go right ahead.
I was going to say, next week we're not going to be here. For what it's worth, I am going to be in Tacoma, Washington, beginning a 5-day gospel meeting there, Wednesday through Sunday. If you want more details on that, email me and I'll be glad to do that. And I know John has some other commitments as well. And so because of that, we don't want to, it's not that we don't trust them, but we don't want Brian and Paul to have to handle this by themselves. So we're just going to take next week off, and we will resume this in 2 weeks. So thank you, everybody, for your comments and so on today. Go ahead, John. Back to you.
That'll put us on the 14th of November.
Right.
Okay, Tom, I appreciate it. You've done a good job in getting us started within the text here, and appreciate those who've been participating in the chat room. And I also want to thank you for joining us for our study. It may be that you are watching this at a later point in time, and I want you to know that it does mean something to us that you find it interesting enough to watch. If we have said something that maybe you disagree with or something you would like to have more questions regarding, don't hesitate to contact us. Off and on through the study, we've kind of brought this little ticker up there, and it shows the different ways you can contact us, such as questions@truthfactor.com. You can do a direct message on Twitter using Truth Factor is our Twitter handle. And then both Facebook and YouTube they are Truth Factor Live. It's the same for both of those. We'd definitely love to hear from you. Any final thoughts or comments from Brian or Paul before we dismiss?
I don't have any. Just have had a good study today. There's a lot going on around my house. Excuse me, around my house today. I'm not in my normal spot in the office, and so I'm sorry if I was a little distracted, but I was able to listen and certainly benefited from our time together.
Thank you, Paul. And I like your background.
Oh, that's my wife's barn quilt. I've been trying to stay off of being centered right underneath it, but I've not done a good job. So,
and Brian, any thoughts?
No final thoughts. Maybe to bring in one last comment out of our Facebook chat, John Quinn made the comment. It's interesting that the lamb that these men were consuming was the Passover lamb. Jesus is our Passover lamb, and that really is a marvelous thought to wrap up on.
Where was that comment at?
Came into our Facebook chat.
I missed that. I have to find out why that one didn't show through.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And Lord willing, we'll continue with our study here in Luke chapter 22. We'll pick up with right around verse 24 in 2 weeks, which should be November the 14th. And so mark your calendars for that. We will, of course, send out notifications. And again, that's November 14th at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
if you're in the Eastern time zone, it'll be noon.
9 a.m. on the Pacific Coast.
And 10 a.m. Mountain Time.
That's right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.